You're listening to the podcast When Life Gives You Lemons, presented by me, Emma Levy. This is the podcast where we interview high-performing individuals who have been through adversity, but who have come back stronger. My hope is that by sharing and exploring these stories, we can help those who have been through adversity and inspire them to do great things. Today, I'm welcoming David Smith MBE to the podcast. I first heard David speak at a conference a few years ago, and I found his story incredibly powerful. David is a Paralympic gold medalist, double world champion, a highly accomplished Nike-sponsored athlete, as well as being a writer, speaker, and coach. David started his sporting life representing Great Britain in karate and bobsleigh, overcoming the fact that he was born with club feet. He then took up rowing, making the British Paralympic team. But in 2010, he was diagnosed with a rare tumor growing in his spinal cord in his neck. He had the tumor surgically removed and built back from scratch, literally teaching himself how to walk again. Remarkably, less than 2 years later, he won a gold medal in the London 2012 Paralympics in the mixed cox 4. Following London 2012, he switched sports and joined the British paracycling team with aspirations to go to Rio Paralympics 2016. Sadly, he never made it there, because a few months prior to competition, he was told that his tumour had returned. 6 years on from that, and he has now had in total 6 surgeries to remove the tumour, with each further surgery bringing new, life-changing challenges. Following his most recent surgery, in 2017, he became paralysed down one side of his body, and now lives his life with a spinal cord injury. Despite this, David continues to defy the odds, and is still passionate about sport, choosing to spend his time often cycling up crazy high mountains. I am continuously inspired by David's story, and I am sure after listening to this, you will be too. Hello, David.
Good evening, Emma. Good evening. Good. And, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've given a really brief synopsis of your tumultuous journey, and if it's okay, I'm going to pick out a few key moments for us to discuss. So if we can kick off by kind of going back to the early 2010s, can you tell us, how do you remember feeling after your initial diagnosis? Did you have an understanding of the life-changing enormity of what was to come?
So I think to answer this probably fairly, I would almost go back to childhood. And there's no lessons in school on emotional intelligence, on life skills, on psychology, on mindset. It's very much around IQ rather than EQ. And, we're not taught how to, as Angela Duckworth would say, to example, what grit is. And grit is, the mix of perseverance and passion. And it's a great measure of success in life. And I guess many people are maybe naturally gritty and others are not. And when I was first sat in front of a doctor, I'd gone through 10, 15 years of medical problems. I'd constantly been visiting doctors with pain, with fatigue. And I was always met with you're doing too much sport. You're doing too much training. You're doing too much of this. Then I was told I had chronic fatigue syndrome. Wow. And then so I was researching what chronic fatigue syndrome was. And then my inner narrative at this point then started to believe that I had chronic fatigue syndrome. So then I was like, I'm David Smith. I am basically chronic fatigue syndrome. So I started to believe this is what I had. And of course, then that manifests all sorts of other things that are going on. So when I actually sat down for the very first time and the neurologist in Windsor held a scan up to the screen and said, look, this is a tumor, there was almost a moment of relief, because I was like, okay, wow, this explains so much. And at that point, I guess my level of understanding of neurobiology, neuroscience was very limited. It was non-existent.
Yeah.
I knew how to build strength and endurance from a physiological, athletic point. I didn't really know much about psychology, as in what's really going on between the ears, and a lot of it was just run on a subconscious program that I'd learned in sport for so many years.
Yeah.
So when I was first diagnosed, there was this instant question of, well, this explains why so many things have been going wrong in my life for all of my life, really. From an early age, I was misdiagnosed with epilepsy. I'd spent 10 years of my childhood on Tegretol medication.
Wow.
And then I had the chronic fatigue syndrome diagnosis, and all these were actually, they were the tumor pressing on the nerves in the spinal cord.
So were you
So
upset were you kind of angry, upset that it had been missed for so many years?
you know what, I didn't really, it was like I was numb. There was like a numb feeling of like, well, this can't really be me. I don't look sick. I don't feel ill.
Yeah.
And then there was the thought of, well, this kind of explains the lack of bowel bladder control, the loss of sexual function, all of these things that had been going on for almost 20 years. Well, at that point, yeah, 10, 15 years. They were like, okay, there's an answer to this. And I think as human beings, when we can understand the why and the what behind something, then we can kind of accept it a little bit better.
Yeah.
So at that point, I was like, okay, I can understand having a tumor in that part of the body is a pretty extreme place to have it. The spinal cord pretty much controls the communication between the brain and the body. And if that's interrupted, then things are not going to work. When I stepped out of that hospital, I drove to Bisham Abbey, and I went straight from a hospital into a high performance environment.
Yeah.
And in that environment, it was all about winning. And in the other environment was all about just trying to live. And then what I didn't know at that time is I'd spend the next 12 years of my life bouncing from high performance sport environment where everyone just wants to win. And then in another environment where everyone is fighting to live. And that really,
what a contrast.
I would say, yeah, that's probably caused a lot of psychological trauma. I've learned a lot from it, but it's also traumatized me massively on what my philosophy is and why I'm here, what's the meaning of life, all these deep questions that it's provoked me to go on to. So that initial day in 2012, I think, was met with a real numbness and that sort of what can't really be happening. But if we look at the Kruber-Ross stages of grief, the first one is denial. And I think it was such a big trauma to hear those words that you go straight into denial mode. And what my coping mechanisms were sport. Yeah. I got the car, drove straight to Bisham Abbey. I didn't want to address it. I thought if I bury my head in the sand, it's going to go away. And
did you tell your team straight away, or you didn't even tell anyone?
Yeah, I went straight and told the doctor, Richard Budgett at the time, who was the British rowing doctor, and he had organised the scans. So I went back and I actually think, I think he possibly already knew, because I think that the scans were done through the English Institute of Sport. So I think he probably already knew, but he wasn't in a position to tell me. So and then they had a plan. And I guess as an athlete, I just followed the plan. I followed it step by step. Yeah. And that was really, I guess, opening a door that I've kind of walked into a room and been stuck in that room ever since.
Yeah. I mean, you've talked about grit. Following that initial diagnosis, you were not long out of the London 2012 Olympics. Did you ever have any doubt that you would make it back in a boat to compete, or did you always believe that you would get there following your surgery?
I think at that point, there was never a moment where there was never a moment of doubt where I thought I'm not going to make it back. And I think a lot of that was just complete ignorance to what had actually happened to me. I didn't realize the severity of it. I had the initial surgery, which was 5 hours. I woke up, I spent 7 days in hospital. I was sent home. I was probably sent home too early. And I had a spinal stroke at home. Yeah. And then I almost died at home, and I was rushed back into hospital, and I went through another emergency surgery to decompress my spinal cord. And that blood clot was sitting very, very high up in my neck. If it had moved a few millimeters higher into the brainstem, then I wouldn't be speaking to you today. So I was probably I was very lucky to survive the blood clot. I think the blood clot in the spinal stroke was potentially more dangerous than the tumor. And so when I woke up from that, at this point, I'd gone from 100-kilo rower to now 69 kilos in a bed.
Wow. Yeah.
And that was a huge drop. And at that point, I was just like, well, I wasn't even focused on the games at that point. There was a world championships 5 months down the line. I thought I was going to get to those world championships. Amazing. So much was, I guess, my self-belief. And everyone around you is telling you can't do it. You're met very much where you can't do this, you can't do that. And I think there was a part of me that was like, well, I'll prove you wrong. And and I think that probably goes back to childhood stuff. And and I committed every single hour, every single minute of every single day to get to that start line. And within 6 months, I was back in a boat. 3 months, I was on an ergo at Caversham. I had to fight to get back into the boat and get into the start line in London. It wasn't a straight line.
Yeah, never is. I always say that as a physio, never a straight line.
It was something I thought I could never go through again. And I always said that to myself in rehab. I was thinking, you know what, this is super intense. There's no way I could ever do this again.
Yeah.
But I've got enough mental fortitude to get through this once. Yeah. And at the end of it, the reward is the highest accolade in sport. So there was a good driver to get there. Yeah. And it was a home games as well. So if you can't get motivated for that, then
and the emotion as you crossed the line, can you remember that emotion as you crossed the line in London?
Yeah, I was like, thank God this is over. it was such, there was so much pressure with the sport. And I know pressure is a privilege, but I think for me, it had been such a traumatic experience to go from the hospital bed, from the spinal stroke, through all the rehabilitation. And, you'll know very well what it's like that when you first go home from that surgery. It's just, it's hard to explain to someone who's maybe not been through it.
Yeah.
But when you first go home and you sleep in your bed that first night and you wake up the first morning and you hear birds and you feel the air, and it's the first time you've heard a bird make a noise in over a month. You've not breathed fresh air in over a month. You've just heard people screaming in pain every night, people dying next to you, all of this stuff. And then you wake up that first morning and you're kind of like, wow, I made it. But there's this outer body experience that I don't think you can explain to someone who's not had that.
Yeah.
And I think only people who have had it will understand what that moment feels like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to cross London, it felt like everything had just happened so fast. And I was like, wow, okay, I'm just, I'm going to get out of this boat and go collect my medal, and then I'm going to go home and go skiing and just forget that this whole chapter of my life even happened, because it was just I just wanted to move on from it.
Yeah.
I didn't want to live off the medal. I didn't want to be go from athlete to celebrity shows and all that. So I didn't want to do any of that. I just wanted to go home to my village and ski with my mates. and that's what, that's kind of what I did.
That's what you did. I've heard you talk about a book, which I also found pivotal in my mental recovery, which was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Can you explain to our listeners what aspects of that book particularly spoke to you?
So that book was given to me in 2016. I'd gone through another surgery in 2014. 2015, I'd been diagnosed again. In 2016, I walked in, went through a 9-hour surgery, and there was mistakes made in that surgery that ultimately paralyzed me from the neck down. Wow. And left me lying. And it was that time someone said, look, have you ever read this book? And I was like, no. And it was probably at that point, I guess, my curiosity had sparked around psychology. I couldn't really use my body anymore.
Yeah.
I knew the tools that I'd used in the previous 3 surgeries were not going to work this time around. This was a different fight, a different animal. So I was like, okay, I need to come at this from a different direction. And somebody gave me that book, and I read it. And I think it's probably one of the most profound books I've ever read.
Yeah.
And I think for me, there were several things that stood out. I think what Viktor Frankl speaks about, stimulus space response, was huge. That's something that I've worked on ever since that moment, to have to sit in that space and actually then respond in a way that's aligned with my values. So definitely the main thing I took from it was the stimulus space response, and especially in rugged environments where the outcome is potential death, and how important to be able to regulate your states is, and ultimately also, and I guess it's from where he got it from Nietzsche, was about if we know our why, we can withstand any how.
Yeah.
And I guess that catapulted me on then into a rabbit hole of philosophy and going to look at what Stoicism is and all the great minds of the world. And I think for me, I was probably somehow trying to search for some form of meaning in all of my suffering. And I'm thinking, well, and if we can have vicarious experiences through someone else, it gives us hope. And I think that so many people, when they read that book, they maybe lean on Viktor Frankl and think, well, if he suffered to that extent, but yet came out and contributed to the world in such a prolific way, then I can do the same. And it taught me that it's not all about the self. Sport can be very selfish. It's, the athlete wants to win the medal for themselves. You hear people saying, oh, I did it for all these other people, but ultimately it's kind of for yourself. I want my medal for myself. Okay, it's great that you inspire people and everything, but ultimately you go on that journey for yourself. But when I read Victor's book, I was thinking, well, actually, if you can do so much other things for humanity as a whole, then that can bring you just your why strengthens so much more. And I didn't realize by reading, and I go back to that book so many times, even now, just to kind of learn. I think learning from people who have got such incredible minds, they've explored their mind in such a depth. There's so much to learn there. And absolutely. I try to sit down with wise people every morning, and most of these wise people are via podcasts and YouTube videos, but just to listen to them and think, okay, what can I take from that may help me, which then I can help someone else.
Yeah, I also go back to that book quite frequently. And actually my mantra is, what is my why? And I kind of like to make sure that I'm always aligned with that. How did you kind of work out what your why was?
Yeah. So I think, in many ways, it probably took to surgery number 6 to really get that, to really sit. And this is something that I don't think can happen overnight. I think knowing your why is Pete Carroll from the Seattle Seahawks talks about this, and their philosophy, along with Dr. Michael Gervais, there was about developing humans, not athletes. They developed good humans. They didn't want to win. They wanted to win, but their philosophy wasn't just about winning. It was about being at their best. And they speak a lot about knowing your personal philosophy, and then that leads to your why and your purpose. So I started to work on what my personal philosophy was, and then I guess through my life it's changed. At one point it was all about winning, and that worked from 2010 to 2012, but I realized from 2016 onwards that's not going to work anymore, so I need to change that. So after reading Viktor Frankl's book and reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and books, along the sort of the similar sort of line, like The Alchemist, I started to realize that actually being present is so important. Being in the moment, that's really where life happens and where magic happens. And we come into this life on an inhale and we leave on an exhale, two of the most important breaths we'll ever take. But it doesn't mean that every breath in between them is not as important, but we're not very aware of them. So my philosophy was very much about being where my feet are all the time, telling myself and remind myself, David, be present, be in the moment. As humans, we live in the past and we live in the future constantly. Things will be better when I get to here, or when I win the next medal, I'm going to be happy, or they're looking back. See, it's very hard to just live in the moment. And with all the technology that's around us now, we get this instant gratification, so it pulls us, and we can spend so much time looking at other people's lives. It's such a dangerous trap to fall into. So I was just like, okay, my philosophy is literally just to be where my feet are. So my why is to get up every day and live it like it's my last. And with that, there's a purpose that's built into that I feel like my purpose is to share the lessons I've learned, not so much from sport, but from going through the hospital situation to other people, to help them how best they can live in the present moment. Because I feel that if humans lived more in the present moment with compassion, curiosity, that society would just be such a better place to live in.
Yeah, because in society, we're kind of brought up, aren't we, to try and achieve goals all the time, and you're always looking forward to that next goal. But do we enjoy the process enough? Like you said, do we enjoy the
I think
now?
if you ask any athlete after they've won a medal, one of the first questions they get asked is, "What's next?
Yeah,
What's next?
yeah,
Well, why can't I just enjoy this moment?"
yeah,
It's always what's next. Even think of how the model of British sport works. The Olympic flame has not even gone out, and we're preparing for the next Olympics.
yeah.
And I understand we have to do that because
Mm.
that's what we do. But also, it's really important that we pause
Yeah,
and be like in the moment, because as Marcus Aurelius and all the great Stoics said, that once we die, the people who cared about us winning those medals, they will also die. And in a few generations from now, none of us will be remembered.
yeah,
And that's a pretty, like when you start to look at memento mori and your own mortality, and you realize in a couple of generations from now, no one will even know who we were.
yeah,
They won't know us. Even the greatest athletes right now, potentially not many people transcend time.
Well, people might remember
Like,
you.
yeah, I spoke to a young athlete the other day, and I said to him, I spoke about Alan Wells. He didn't even know who Alan Wells was.
Yeah,
21-year-old athlete. He's like, "Who's that?" And I
yeah,
was like, "Wow." And that really made me think. I was like,
yeah,
okay, if he was the last white man, we would call it what it is, to win the 100 meters. And the athlete who's 20-year-old now didn't know who he was.
yeah, yeah,
He's not transcending time.
yeah.
And
It's very
there's very,
interesting.
very few people do. So I think it's so important. Okay, we need to set these goals and we need to always strive, but it's also very important to try and live in the present moment and be where your feet are.
Yeah, absolutely. Your tumor has unfortunately come back a few times. As someone, who's been through cancer, I know that one of the hardest things I deal with is that fear of recurrence. So I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with that fear of it coming back?
I think first of all is that it's acknowledging it. It is there, and I read a great book by Susan David, who wrote a book called Emotional Agility, and she talked about not suppressing the emotion. She's a big fan of Viktor Frankl as well, and she uses the analogy of don't think of the pink elephant, and it, you can't not think of it. And I think if you tell someone not to think of something for the next minute, they think of it on average 40 times. I think the data showed.
Wow.
So if I say, "Oh, don't think about a reoccurrence," then that's pretty much going to be on your mind. And then we know from science, the more you think of something, the more you strengthen that neural pathway. So then it becomes this daily narrative. So what I try to do is, again, I try to be present. I try to be in the present moment. I try to get into flow states. So I've worked out what are my flow triggers. And I find that the more I'm engaging in clear goals, things with meaning and purpose that align with my values, the busier I am, the more focused I can be. I don't really ever give thoughts to it. It doesn't come into my mind because I'm just busy living.
Yeah.
But I've also done a lot of therapy. I've sat on many, many couches and probably done over 500 hours of therapy to get to that point. I don't think you can just press a button and arrive there. You have to do the work. And the reward of doing that work is being able to then reframe it, take your attention away from it, and focus on other things. And one of the great helps for me was I did some work with Steve Peters, and he said to me before my scans, he's like, "Don't build what if bridges."
Yeah.
Because you build this what if bridge, then you get your scan, you're clear, and then but you've spent so much energy and time, which time's the most precious thing we have, building a what if bridge, and then you get there, and if it is a positive scan, then you deal with it when you're there. And it goes back again to what the great philosophers talk about living in the present moment, not the past, not the future. And that's easier said than done. And I would, anyone who's listening to this and this is the first time they're exploring this sort of conversation, it's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and be able to just think in the present moment. It just doesn't really work like that. You have to do the work. And I think as someone who's had one tumor, there is always a worry there. And I think that, you know, journaling's great. I did a lot of journaling, allowing moments where it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to sit with those thoughts, self-awareness, doing the mindfulness work and being like, well, okay, there is a chance that this could reoccur, but there's also a chance that someone who's never been diagnosed will also get diagnosed.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's a lot of CBT type language, you know, show me the evidence. Where's the evidence that it's going to reoccur at the next scan? And then it's just, again, going back to your why, the values, and ultimately, paradoxically, if you do live with that over your head, it could be, if you reframe it into a way that actually this is giving me an understanding on how to live. Because I've walked that line of mortality, so I have the right to be like, you know what, I am mentally strong.
Yeah.
But also it's okay to cry. It's okay to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And to, like you said, to acknowledge your emotion.
Acknowledge the emotions.
So
you know, Susan David says emotions are they're data points. They're not truths, or, you know, they're just data points, and they show us what's happening in the environment around us.
Yeah.
But for me, when I have those thoughts, I quickly go to my journal. I look at what my values are, what my why is, what my philosophy is, and then I'm like, okay, am I living that life?
Yeah.
Am I going out and living everything so that I know if it did come back, I could lie there and be at peace with my own mortality? And that's, you know, I don't say that lightly. But it's also our reality, and that's a very tough piece of work to do, and it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
And if someone had told me and diagnosed one to do that work, I'd be like, hell no. But after 6 times now, I'm like, okay, I can do this work a little bit. I think it's beneficial.
Yeah.
And it does help me. But I would always encourage people to, you know, seek a professional, and
absolutely.
And what works for me, what works for you is totally different, and it's not for everybody.
Yeah. Will you talk to us a bit about flow states? Because I'm not sure everyone listening will know what flow states is.
Yeah, I guess to put it simple, it's being in the zone, as athletes would talk about. If you think of a surfer, or you think of an extreme skier in backcountry skiing, they're so focused on in the moment that nothing else matters. It's when you're completely absorbed in a task at hand that time just disappears. You know, 20 minutes go, an hour goes, and you come up from the work. You know, writers can get it, musicians get it, artists get it. You know, if you sat down to work at your desk and you've looked at the clock and it was 10 o'clock in the morning, the next thing it's 5 at night, very likely you're in a flow state at some point. It's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's the sort of, I guess, that he's credited with the terminology of flow states. It goes further back than him, but he's the most famous name, I think, that's used in the world of positive psychology to describe it. But he talks about, you know, having clear goals. There's a challenge skill balance. If the challenge is just enough to stretch you out your comfort zone, then you'll be focused, because focus precedes flow. You can't get into flow if you're not focused. So if you're task switching, you won't get into a flow state. So you've got to be completely 100% immersed in it, completely fully focused in it, and it's got to stretch you just out of that comfort zone, not to the point where it causes anxiety, but if something's so easy that it's kind of boring, it's unlikely you're not going to get into flow brushing your teeth.
Yeah.
So it's about getting out there and moving the body, and for many people, that's why sport is an access and gateway to flow. But as is sitting playing the piano, if you watch some of the greatest pianists play, they're in complete flow state. So if you've never seen it before, watch some of the Red Bull guys, or watch some of the greatest musicians and performers. You can see them in a flow state where they're completely immersed in that, and your brain is actually part of the prefrontal cortex kind of goes offline a little bit, your self-critic. So that inner voice really gets dialed down at that point. So actually you don't have that inner voice of like, well, I might get diagnosed again. What if I get diagnosed again? That voice gets turned down.
Yeah. So is it a form of meditation?
I would say it is. And I think a lot of the people who study it and are the sort of forefront of that research would argue as well that it is a form of meditation. And I think, you know, a lot of people can't, like, I can't sit still and meditate. I've got way too much energy to do that.
Yeah.
But I use sport as a form of meditation. And I think that's important, because if you say to meditation is such a beneficial thing to do, but some people just can't sit still with their own thoughts. It's too much.
Yeah. Oh,
but,
I'm terrible at it.
yeah, but you could be mindfully walking, you know,
Exactly.
if you're walking on the street, put your phone in your pocket.
Yeah.
Be mindful of every step, listen to the birds, notice people, see people, say good morning. That's a form of meditation as well. And it's just, again, being in the present moment.
Yeah. So pre-diagnosis, do you think you were achieving flow states in sport or not?
Yeah, I definitely was. I didn't know what they were. You know, like I'd grown up as a skier, and I'd always skied things that were out of my ability almost. So when I was off-piste in backcountry, of course, the only thing that I was focusing on was every turn.
Yeah.
So I was in a flow state. When I was fighting in karate, if my head was somewhere else, I'd have got knocked out. So for sure, I was in flow states. Rowing, I was definitely in a flow state when you're in the boat and everything's moving. I think every sport I've been in, I think they just train you to get into flow states. And okay, on long sessions where you're out for 3 hours, you can't be in a flow state for 3 hours. You can drift in and out of it, but usually the flow state's maximum 90 minutes.
Yeah.
But
so interesting you were in them. So sorry, I just think so interesting you were in the flow states, but you didn't know what they were, and now you understand what that is. I find that quite an interesting concept.
Yeah, I think, and that all spanned from Viktor Frankl's book, because it spiked a curiosity of learning about the mind, learning about the physiology, the psychology, just basically, I guess, everything that's behind this human experience. And I felt that the more I could understand that, the better it would be for me dealing with paralysis. And, you know, the tumor has been a pretty hard thing to deal with, but the tumor was there. I couldn't have done anything to prevent the tumor. It was there. But there's a lot of stuff that could be done to have prevented me being paralyzed.
Yeah.
I 100% believe that I shouldn't be paralyzed.
Really?
That was a series of mistakes.
Medical mistakes.
Medical mistakes that led to me being paralyzed. And that, I feel, in many ways in 2016, I died on that bed when I woke up, because I've never walked again. I've never skied again.
Yeah.
My life is in constant disarray with the paralysis. I barely sometimes leave my house because of the paralysis, because the anxiety it's caused. So for me, the paralysis has been much harder to deal with.
Yeah, the spinal cord injury. I was interested, actually. I was wondering that. I was wondering if you identified as a person who's had cancer or a spinal cord injury patient. And the reason why I find that quite interesting is because, as someone who's been through cancer, that community is quite important to me. And, you know, sometimes that cancer community has provided support. And so I wondered if you kind of use either of those communities for support, and which one you kind of identify more with.
It's a good question, and I'm going to be very careful how I answer this, because I know that identity is everything to everyone. I've done a lot of work on this. And I think for all of my life, when someone asked who I was, I would say I'm an athlete. And Steve Peters challenged me once. He said, who are you? And I was like, well, I'm an athlete. And he's like, no, you're not. I was like, huh? And he's like, you're not. He says, you go and work out who you are. And I was like where do I even start with that? So then I realized, actually, that saying that David Smith is an athlete is like saying I'm a BMW because I have a BMW car. I'm not a BMW. I just happen to have a BMW. I'm not an athlete. I just happen to do sport. So I'm not cancer. I'm not a spinal cord injury. I just happen to have a tumor, and I happen to have a spinal cord injury. So there's a separation right away. So it's not who I am.
Yeah.
I'm more than that. So then that's where values came in. So I looked at my values. I looked at my character strengths, and I started to discover, okay, David's someone who's very keen on the love of learning. He's curious. He's a funny guy. He's a loyal guy. He's persistent. These values that he holds dear to himself. That's who I am. That's my moral fiber. And I have just happened to have these things that are attached to who he is, but they're not me. And I think this is a great thing in athletes who, when they come to a transition at the end of their career, that if all they've ever identified was being an athlete, they're going to struggle, because actually they're human first. And who's the human? What makes up the human? What's the values and your strengths and your likes and your passions, and knowing what your passion is and your vision, all of these things, all that work helps you through transitions. And as you'll know, breast cancer is a transition. Going through years of being a physio at the EIS, there's transitions between jobs, between athletes. It's always everything's a transition, and how you manage those transitions. If you're holding on so tightly to the identity that you are a physio, that if that goes, then you lose everything. And when I was holding on so tightly and I was paralyzed, and I have this body now that doesn't look like an athlete, that caused a lot of mental health issues, to the point where I didn't even want to live. So I was like, okay, I need to find out who I am. In the respect of the communities, I've kind of stayed away from them, if I'm being honest, because it didn't really work for me.
Right.
I found people in spinal cord injuries who were smashing it. So I wanted to find people like Karen Dark, like Janie Seymour, people who had had a spinal injury, but they had gone on to ski to the North Pole, climb Everest, people who were the outliers. I found when I was in Stoke Mandeville that I was struggling, because I didn't want to be a spinal cord injury person. It sucks. I hate it. I cry most weeks because of it. It absolutely breaks me. But I'm like, I can't hold on for a cure, because I don't know if there ever will be a cure. All I can do is show up every day and do the best I can. So I was going to rehab for a long time, but I was with a lot of people who had given up. And I struggled, because I was like, wow, they're less injured than me and they're giving up. I was like, yeah, okay, I need to remove myself from this environment and go to an environment back into high performance sport. So I surrounded myself with all the people who weren't sick, and they weren't talking about it. They were just like talking about normal things and not asking how I was, and having, I guess, that moment. So for me, that was important. Now, when I was in radiotherapy, I did go to the living room at the Macmillan Centre, and I sat with people and we spoke, and I needed that at that point, because we shared that strength. That was very important. And even now, when I meet someone who's been touched by this, there's a connection, and I like that, and it's nice. And there's this sort of like level of compassion and empathy that you don't get from people who have not been through this. So I understand why people want to go back to those groups, because there's like a love. And I met a gentleman last week in Mallorca. His wife had passed away of a brain tumor, and he asked if he could hug me. And I was like, okay. And he hugged me. And when he hugged me, I felt like he was hugging his wife.
Wow. And
it was pretty cathartic for both of us. It was very, very strange feeling. But I don't even know how to put that into words. I think that I feel myself closer to the cancer community, not the spinal cord injury community. I struggle, because it's just, I've not accepted it. It's too overwhelming for me. I can't face it. But the going into the radiotherapy in that community, I feel really dearly. And I think it's a reminder of how lucky we are to be alive, but also how close we are for things being taken away from us. And we don't know what we've got until we lose it.
Absolutely. You've said how hard this has been for you, and how you could have given up. So I want to know, where do you get your resilience from?
Good question. I guess there's a huge debate on whether you're born resilient or is it a nurture nature thing.
That's what I'm interested. What do you think on that?
To be honest with you, I think it was a lot. And before coming on here, I was listening to Angela Duckworth talk, actually, and she spoke about kids, and she said if kids are not If everything's done for them, they will never learn to do things for themselves.
Yeah.
So by giving them overlove, you're almost being cruel. So if you're cooking all their meals for them, doing everything for them, they will never learn how to do it themselves.
Yeah.
So it's actually good to encourage them to do the washing, to do cooking. It's not child slavery. You're actually giving them life skills. And I think back to how I was when I was growing up. If I fell out a tree and hurt myself, my parents were like, you need to get off the ground and dust yourself down.
Yeah.
They didn't rush to me and be like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, are you okay? I am covered in scars from learning how to live. In karate, I've got multiple broken noses from karate. But I remember getting punched in a training session in a dojo in Aberdeen and broke my nose, and I was like unconscious for a split second. But when I came round, the instructor was like, get up, go again.
Yeah.
2 bits of tissue. No, this is really not for everyone, but 2 bits of tissue and you go again. You face your fear. Courage is fear walking.
Yeah.
And I look back at all of those lessons that I learned in sport, learning how to lose. When you get beat, what does that feel like? What emotions does it cause? How do you reset and go again? And I guess I grew up in a generation where it was like, get on with it.
Yeah.
Don't come to me crying if the school bully punches you.
Yeah.
Do something about it.
Yeah.
And I think all of that lessons have served me very well now.
Yeah.
Because I think that was my resilience training.
Absolutely.
And especially spending 3 weeks in Japan and being in the dojos in Japan at 17-year-old and genuinely getting hit hard and getting back up and going again, because you just couldn't stop. You couldn't walk out the dojo and say, hey, I've had enough, I'm out of here. You just didn't do that.
So you had this resilience within you, probably from your sporting history, which has most likely really helped you on your journey now.
Yeah, and I always believe that I think sport gave me the mindset and the physiology to deal with cancer and paralysis, but those 2 latter things really taught me how to live.
Yeah. So it took you beyond, basically. Yeah. That I guess that's like the spiritual element coming into it and going into the meaning of life and the meaning of my life and your life and others' lives. And I think the lessons I learned from sitting in a radiotherapy room, watching all these different people from babies to people in their 90s, and then coming up onto the street where everyone was angry and everyone looked sad. Yeah. And
then actually collectively in the radiotherapy room, people were kind of, I'm not going to say they were happy, they were kind of happy. There was people smiling and joking, and the staff were amazing. They make it. And then you come up onto the street and it's like 2 different worlds. And I'm like, we need to, the world in the basement, the world above need to learn about what's going on in the basement.
Well, it helps you put stuff into perspective, I think. And it's about not sweating the small stuff anymore. I think that's when you face something big, when you then face something little, you're like, meh.
It's not really a big deal, and it's the same, if I leave a coffee cup or spill a little bit of chocolate on the sofa, it causes a huge domestic argument. I'm like, look, no one's died. Like, no one's died, and like and I think that people are stretched right to the limit. That's stimulus space response. We have no space. We're reactive beings, and then that's usually reflected on our loved ones. And if we could just pause, take a breath sometimes, and respond with the person you really want to be, communication between people, and then, like you say, the small stuff then becomes so. I'm pretty sure Viktor Frankl wasn't sweating the small stuff.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
He dealt with so much. I'm pretty confident that guy wasn't going to get upset if someone cut him up in a car.
Yeah, exactly.
And because stress is accumulative. It's like a dripping tap. And if you're getting stressed because someone's cut you up in a car and you're angry and you're shouting, that's the stuff that's going on inside your body at a cellular level.
Yeah.
That's not a good place to be. And again, you don't know the person that's cut you up, they might be late for a
Mm-hmm.
chemotherapy session.
Yeah.
They might have just been diagnosed with a brain tumor. You do
Mm.
not know what they're going through.
Yeah.
And you're reactive. I always try to say, people, just pause for a minute.
Yeah.
Every human being is going through something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just come every day. I step out the door. I always say, David, compassion. Leave the
Mm.
house with compassion.
Yeah.
Whoever you encounter today is facing something.
Yeah. So you really do live by kind of these values that you want to achieve.
I try.
Yeah. It's hard. Yeah.
Sometimes I get hijacked. I get hijacked by my amygdala, limbic brain,
Mm.
and I don't. I think you'd have to be a Zen monk living in a temple in Tibet to be
Yeah.
fully aligned. I think it's very, very hard.
Yeah.
I think it's very challenging to
Absolutely.
be to completely Zen. Like, I think what I try to do is I try to create an environment around me that best facilitates
Mm.
David being the person that he wants to be. And a big part of that was actually leaving high performance sport,
Right.
because I couldn't be that person in high
Mm.
performance sport. I
Yeah.
struggled, that environment doesn't often lend itself to the human person.
Mm.
It's more about targets and spreadsheets and hitting medals. And I
Mm.
just feel that it's actually we need to probably do a little bit better with looking after the human there as well.
Yeah. So in terms of specific strategies which you use, we've touched on quite a lot. We've touched on flow states, philosophy, values, journaling. Is there anything else that you use that we might not have mentioned yet?
Having fun,
Yeah.
having fun and laughing. I think, we can be so serious at times. And I think,
Mm.
if you look at when times are really hard, and, it might even be in the lead up to an Olympic final or something that's really intense, and someone just says something funny and it breaks the ice.
Yeah.
And, you see it in the hospital, if you're sitting in the waiting room and there's silence, and in the water fountain, or someone goes to do something and they trip or something, and everyone kind of like sniggers under their breath, and
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
just breaks that. And I know when we were in hospital, in the spinal cord hospital especially, I was so fortunate to have a rugby player on one side of me and an army guy on the one other side of me, and we had such a dark humor. And I remember Victor Frankl talking about this as well,
Yes. Yeah.
that outside that hospital, I think people would have been like, you can't do that. But in that environment, the laugh inside of it got us through. And I
Mm.
think, to have jokes and goof around, I think
Yeah.
is great. And I often say, if you go into a room full of children, they're all laughing and playing, and oh, what's your name? What do you do? What giraffe? Do you like
Mm.
giraffes? And then you go into a room full of adults and they're deadly serious and no one will
Yeah.
speak. And I'm like, we've lost. We got to try and keep a little bit of that
Mm.
childlike fun and humor. And where there's obviously a part in our life where we kind of lose that innocence. And I love. I think if something that we could inject a little bit more into the world, because we're one click away from negativity. Oh my God, you turn on the news and it's just doom and gloom everywhere. And I understand everyone's going through a hard time, but amongst that, it's important still to
Mm.
laugh and have fun. and
Yeah.
and there's no better person to laugh at than yourself, and
Yeah.
just lighten the mood. And I think humor is really important. I think it's a key ingredient in any world that we're working in, even in high performance environment. I still think it's important to, if when
Yeah.
things go wrong, sometimes to laugh and be like, okay, no one died here, but
Yeah. Yeah.
that was a pretty stupid thing to do.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's great to laugh, isn't it? And I think
Yeah.
that's a really nice place to kind of tie things off if we end on, that it's so important to have fun. But I do like to end with one final question.
Yeah.
If you could go, back in time to when things were really at their toughest, what do you
Mm-hmm.
wish you could have told yourself?
I'm working on my stimulus space response because it's a very good question. And I wouldn't do anything different. I think the person who showed up every time is got me to where I need to be. If I could go back at all at any point, it would be just before I was paralyzed. And I would have gone to a different hospital.
Really? Wow.
I would have got second opinions, third opinions, and that stimulus space response, I paid the ultimate price for not having that. And that's why that's such a big, that's why when you first asked the question, what did you take from that book? It was that.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have that space. I had the stimulus, and then I was just like, okay, let's have the surgery.
Yeah.
And I think in that instance, if I could go back to any point of my life, it would be that point in that moment and be like, I'm going away from here. I'm going to take time. Because I hid in sport. I went straight to sport. That was always the coping mechanism. Straight out of those surgeries, straight out of the consultation room, straight onto my bike. But I can't deal with this. I had no support. I had no oncology, no psychology at that point. I was just like, I'll just hide in sport. But you can't hide, because as you know, you can't hide. You have to deal with this. And I didn't have people around me that could help me. It was, people didn't know, and I was very like, oh, I'll just push on. If I could go back to any point in my life, I'd step away from that and I'd be like, I need help. And I need help from somebody who critically thinks, who's smart enough to be like, okay, we're going to go and speak to all of these different doctors. We're going to get all of these opinions, and then we're going to make a decision.
Yeah.
Because this is the third time it's reoccurred, and clearly something is not working. This approach that's being used is not working. And if it's the same approach again, it's going to reoccur again, which it did.
Yeah.
And if I had done that,
yeah,
I wouldn't be paralyzed today.
Yeah. Yeah. But you can only say that when you look back, can't you? We can all be clever in retrospect.
Yeah. And I've had to work on that. I've had a lot of psychology around that, and not being hard on myself, because I blamed myself.
Yeah.
And then my psychologist as well, it's not your fault. You weren't to know.
Exactly.
It's not your fault. And we can only go with the information that's given to us and the people we trust. And I think what I would always encourage people, if they're facing the battle, the journey, or whatever it may be that the two of us have been on, is that it's hugely emotional. And to know that when you're emotional, you don't make rational decisions.
Yeah.
Get somebody who's a little bit less emotional that can make your logical decisions for you and help you. Lean on people, and ultimately get multiple opinions, and don't take your first answer. You have to push, you have to push, and you have to push these people. And, I know they're under a lot of strain and a lot of pressure, but it's your life.
Yeah.
And if you don't shout for your life, nobody will.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for your honesty today. I think your story is remarkable. I really do. I think, when I see you on Instagram cycling up these mountains, knowing as a physio that, you don't have the use of one side of your body, I'm quite amazed by it. And when we go offline, I'm going to ask how you do that. But, thank you so much. If people want to know more about you, where can they find you? Are you on social media? Or?
I don't tend to use social media. I'm on Instagram, just David Smith MBE. I write a weekly column for the Herald newspaper in Scotland, so I'm more active there. And they can find me on LinkedIn. Actually, I use Instagram and LinkedIn as the two. Just David Smith MBE, and I have a website with some videos and stuff. So
great, thanks. I really think this talk will inspire people that are going through similar things. So thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you, Emma. Thank you.
That was a brilliant episode with David today. If you enjoyed listening, please do subscribe, rate and review, because it really, really makes a difference to us. We're so excited that the first series of When Life Gives You Lemons is sponsored by Co's Linen. Co's supply some of the UK's finest hotels with luxury linens, including bedding, towels and bathrobes. So if you want to feel like you're on holiday or a spa break every day, then I can highly recommend their products. I really love my personalised bathrobe. You know that feeling when you've had a long day at work or a really hard workout? That's when all I want is to have a hot bath, dry myself in my fluffy Co's towel, and then relax on the sofa. And that is when you'll find me in my Co's bathrobe. Honestly, the most cosy item I've ever owned. All products can be personalised with custom monograms designed by leading interior designer Sophie Patterson. You can find them exclusively online at www.coslinen.com. Listeners to When Life Gives You Lemons can save 10% with the discount code POD10. You can find a link in the show notes.